If I could turn back time, this is the guy that I wish I had when I started playing, and this video is going to teach you everything that you need to know to confidently play Commander and go from a level 1 crook to a level 100 boss, even if you've never played Magic. Magic can be a very complicated game, so I'm going to make it as simple as I can. I'm going to leave some stuff out and take some shortcuts to keep it simple and not overwhelming. The things that you don't learn here, your playgroup can help you with, because this is after all a social format, and the people you play with should be interested in teaching you and helping you along the way if you tell them that you're new. At the end of this video, I'm also going to share some of my favorite resources for newer players, so stay tuned for that. Let's start with making sure you know exactly what Commander is. It's a social version of Magic the Gathering that is played with 4 players. You each have a deck of cards, and you take turns to play out your deck with the hopes of winning. Where traditional Magic is very competitive and a bit more like chess, Commander is a bit more like a board game. There is a winner, but it's more about the experience. Expect good-natured trash talk, deal-making, politics, and hijinks. As the ultimate goal of the game is to defeat all your opponents, there are 3 common ways to do that. The most common is by reducing a player's life total from 40 to 0 across a game. The second most common is by doing commander damage, and dealing a total of 21 combat damage to a player with your commander across a game. Lastly, you can also win the game by using a card that specifically says win the game. These cards usually have certain requirements that you need to meet, and you win the game on the spot. As Magic is a card game, achieving anything will require you to play a bunch of cards. In the average deck, this will normally include a bunch of lands for resources, an army of creatures, and cards to support them. You'll also play a bunch of cards to disrupt your opponents. Given everything relies on the cards, let's look at how they work, starting with the anatomy of a Magic card. There's a famous saying in Commander that reading the card explains the card, and that's generally very true. But you need to know how to read a Magic card to begin with, and where to look for the important stuff. Each non-land card has a mana cost in the top right-hand corner, and this tells you 2 key things. First, the amount of mana and type or color of that mana that you need in order to play that card, and what the color identity of the card is. There are numerous types of cards in Magic, and what type a card is has many impacts on the game. For now, you just need to know that this is where you look if you need to know what a card's type is. Cards that can be used in combat have power and toughness. These numbers determine how much damage they do to either another creature or a player, as well as how much damage needs to be done to them in order to destroy them. Cards without power and toughness typically can't be destroyed by cards that deal damage. Each Magic card has its abilities written in this box, and this is where the reading the card explains the card part comes in. This is going to sound a bit stupid, but you're going to make so many mistakes because you didn't read cards properly. This happens to the best of us, but a big piece of advice is to read your cards carefully. It'll make using them and playing Magic much easier. Within this box, you'll come across a variety of abilities. Here are a few of the main types of abilities that you'll come across. Static or passive abilities just do their thing constantly after they've been played. This could be an ability that affects that specific card, like flying on a creature, or it could be an ability that affects lots of other cards, like giving all your creatures more power and toughness, or perhaps even reducing the cost of your cards. Activated abilities require a cost to be paid to get the desired effect. The cost could be tapping the card, paying some mana, or sacrificing another card. You pay the cost, and you get the effect. And you can do this as many times as you like, as long as you can pay the cost. Triggered abilities are like activated abilities, except the desired outcome happens as a trigger caused by something else. Cards with triggered abilities usually can easily be spotted as they have the words at, if, or when at the start of their ability text. This is probably a good time to mention counters. Many abilities in Magic create what we call counters. These buffs effectively provide a static-like ability in various ways. For example, there are +1/+1 counters that make your creatures stronger, flying counters which can enable said creatures to fly, and things like loyalty counters to put on your planeswalkers. What on earth is a planeswalker? Well, let's talk about the different types of cards. As we talk about them, I'm going to bundle the cards into 2 groups, permanents and non-permanents. Like the name suggests, permanents stick around when you play them, and they provide their abilities until they are either destroyed or die. Non-permanents give you an immediate effect when you play them, after which they go to your graveyard. Let's start with the permanents. Lands are our energy. We use them to create mana, which we use to pay for our cards. There are 6 types of lands, which also correspond with a color: swamps, mountains, forests, islands, plains, and wastes. Costs that appear as a circle with a number inside can be paid with any type of lands. Creatures are arguably the most important card type, as most games end as a result of being attacked by creatures that reduce our life total down to 0. Creatures have power and toughness, and importantly, have summoning sickness, or as my friend says, they're sleepy, and they cannot take actions the turn that you play them. Next up is enchantments, and there are 2 key types of enchantments. As the name suggests, they enchant something. There are those that sit on your board and enchant a whole bunch of stuff, typically just called enchantments, and there are those that enchant one specific permanent, typically called auras. If the permanent an aura is attached to is destroyed, the aura disappears. Unlike magic enchantments, artifacts are magic items that have abilities. But like enchantments, you also have artifacts that can buff a bunch of stuff, or you have artifacts that can be used if you pay a cost. There are also equipment, which work very similarly to auras, except if the creature using it were to die, the equipment stays behind. Planeswalkers are powerful beings that have activated abilities on them. Activating one of their abilities either adds or removes counters from them, and these counters also act as their life total. There are also battles, but they're rare, so you can figure them out later. Much more important than battles are tokens, because you'll see them everywhere. These temporary cards are created by abilities on your actual cards, from token creatures, to treasures that make you mana, to food that gives you life. The only difference between a card and a token is that tokens die if they leave the battlefield for any reason. But what about the non-permanents? First, we have sorceries, and these are powerful cards that come with all sorts of impactful short-term abilities, from drawing you cards, to destroying things, to taking extra turns. You play the sorcery, you get the powerful ability, and that card goes to your graveyard. Instants are just like sorceries, except you can play them whenever you want. I'll explain when you can play what type of card shortly. Where sorceries are all brute force and power, instants are nimble, and you can mess with your opponent's best laid plans when they least expect it, which gives instants immense power. They do similar things as their slower counterparts, with a slight tax on their cost for increased functionality. Speaking of instants, if you're finding this useful, consider subscribing and liking the video at instant speed. Join the community as I make a lot of Magic content that you as a newer player will find useful and enjoy. So we know all the different types of cards, but where do we put them when we play them? Magic has different zones where cards exist, and somewhat standard places for you to put your cards when you play them, which I'll show you. Well, let's dive into that. The first zone cards will be in is your deck or library, then your command zone, where your commander will sit until you play them. When you start the game, you'll draw your opening hand, and your hand is another zone. When you play your cards, they'll first go into the stack, which we'll come back to, but more importantly, they'll end up on the battlefield. Lands go at the bottom, creatures at the top, and all the other stuff typically goes in the middle. When things are destroyed, they'll go to your graveyard, unless they are exiled, in which case they will go to the exile zone. The key difference between the two is that in Magic there are many ways to use your graveyard as a resource and get things back, but it's all but impossible to do that to stuff that's in exile. Now that you know about zones, let's go back to the command zone and your commander. Each commander deck, which is the deck of cards that you use to play the game, has a legendary creature as the commander that is the leader of your deck. This leader impacts your deck in a few ways. Firstly, it determines what color cards you can use in your deck. Remember the color identity from earlier? Cards that fit within the combination of colors of your commander or color identity can be played within your deck. Your commander's ability will also have certain synergies that will greatly affect what cards you end up putting in your deck. Before the game starts, your commander sits in the command zone, and you can play it at any time by paying its mana cost. If your commander dies or changes zones, you can move it back to the command zone at any time. Anytime it goes back to the command zone, 2 mana is added to its mana cost as a tax to encourage players to think carefully about how and when they play their commander, and to balance the power that commanders add to the game. In order to have a commander, you first need a commander deck, and for any new player, I highly recommend you start with a commander pre-constructed deck. There are tons of them, and they're all pretty good. I recommend against trying to build your own deck at the start, because deck building is a whole separate skill set and is arguably as complicated as playing Magic itself. A commander precon is built to be a balanced and fully functioning deck with all the types of cards that you need to play a game. For that reason, picking up a commander precon deck is the quickest way to get you playing with your friends. Other than that, I definitely recommend some sleeves for your deck and maybe a playmat to play on if you can get one. Assuming you have all that, it's time for the big moment. You're sitting down to play your first commander game. Before the game starts, there are usually some pre-game conversations. People talk about what decks and commanders they're playing, and how powerful their decks are, so that the group can have a fair game. The most important thing for you here will be to convey that you're a beginner if they don't already know that, and that you're running a precon, as that should cause them to play a deck that's not too strong. In the middle of the table, someone will likely have set up a phone to track player life totals, and the group will either use that phone or roll dice to determine who plays first. You then draw a hand of 7 cards. If your hand is bad, you should mulligan, which means putting the cards back, shuffling, and drawing 7 again. An acceptable hand typically has 3 to 4 lands and some spells. Don't hunt for the best possible hand, but also don't accept a completely unplayable one. Once everyone has a hand, the game starts, and players take turns in a clockwise direction around the table. At the beginning of each turn, including your first, draw a card. The next step here is taking your turn. Each turn in Magic follows the same structure, broken into what we call phases, and I would suggest learning the structure really well, as it'll make your turn, and when you do what, very simple. Starting with the untap phase. This is where you reset all your cards so that they can be used again this turn. This is probably also a good time to talk about tapping. In Magic, turning a card sideways, or tapping it, is how we show that it's been used this turn. Typically, you'll tap a land to show that you use it to make mana, or a creature to show that it's attacked, or as part of a cost for an activated ability. Importantly, a creature that is tapped cannot block, but more on that when we talk about combat. Then, we have the upkeep phase. All you really have to know here is that many cards in Magic will do things at the beginning of your upkeep, and this is the point in your turn that those things will happen. After that, you draw your card for the turn, which is surprisingly easy to forget. Saying untap, upkeep, draw to yourself in your head as you start your turn should make sure that you don't forget. Now we move on to the first of 2 main phases. Your main phase is when you will play the vast majority of your cards. In fact, it's the only time that you can play cards that are not an instant or a flash card. A reminder that instants and cards with flash can be played whenever you want. Lands are really important, and they are usually the first card you will play if you have one. Under normal circumstances, you can play 1 land per turn, and as many other cards as you want, provided that you have the lands or mana to pay for their costs. After you're done with your main phase, we go to combat. Arguably the most important and impactful part of each turn, this is when you use your creatures to attack your opponents. Combat has a whole lot going on, but to simplify it, there's declaring attackers, declaring blockers, and the damage step. In the attackers phase, you can decide if you want to attack with any of your creatures, and if so, who you want to attack. In Magic, you can only attack a player or one of their planeswalkers. You cannot choose to attack anything else. Once you've declared which of your creatures is attacking, it's time for the defending players to declare their blockers. Defending players can choose which of their creatures they want to use to block, and they can block a single attacking creature with as many creatures as they like. In this way, you can use a whole bunch of little guys to defeat a scary big guy. And a reminder that only untapped creatures can block. Once blockers are declared, we move to the damage step. Any unblocked creatures will deal damage to the player they were attacking, and if blockers were declared, the creatures deal damage to each other. But how do we know what lives and what dies? Well, we compare the power of your attacker with the toughness of the blocking creature, and vice versa. If the power is equal to or greater than the toughness, the creature dies. If there were multiple blockers, you get to decide how you want your damage dealt to those blocking creatures. and if you have enough damage, which lives or dies. Once all the damage has happened, it's important to know that creatures that are dealt damage but don't die temporarily have their toughness reduced until the end of the turn. This means a creature that would normally withstand some more damage may not do so well if someone has cards that deal damage to those creatures later in the turn. Okay, combat is already complex, but one more thing. There are a few important abilities that relate to combat, like Trample, First Strike, and Double Strike. Trample sees any extra damage over and above the blocker's toughness go through to hit the defending player. First Strike, as the name suggests, means that instead of creatures hitting each other at the same time, the creature with First Strike deals their damage first, and that if the other creature survives, they get to deal damage back. A creature with Double Strike will deal First Strike damage and then regular damage. Got it? Good, because it's time for the second main phase. This is a second chance for you to play your cards, and given how much can happen in combat, deciding when you want to play your cards, either before or after the big fights, can be quite important. Last, but definitely not least, we have the end of the turn step. The end of the turn plays a few important roles. Firstly, your creature's toughness resets back to normal if they've taken damage that turn, and all other temporary buffs for that turn will end. Also, much like other cards that trigger on your upkeep, there are ones that trigger on your end step, so that would happen. This is also when you need to discard cards if you have more than 7 in your hand, as that's the most cards that you can be holding at the end of your turn. And finally, the end step is when players, especially blue players, will cast instant spells before you pass the turn to them. Technically, players also get a chance to cast spells at the end of each phase in your turn, but this is the place they're most likely to do it. Speaking of casting spells, we should definitely talk about the stack. Whenever you play a card that's not a land card from your hand in Magic, you announce that you're playing it. You'll tap the necessary land to make the required mana to cast the card, and it becomes a spell that goes on the stack. Which is important, as you have cards like Counterspell that say counter target spell, and it's important to know that all cards become spells when you cast them and while they're on the stack. Counterspell is also a really good example of why the stack exists, as people need an opportunity to engage with the cards you play. If no one interrupts your spell, the spell resolves, and the card takes effect, either going to the battlefield if it's a permanent, or to your graveyard if not. So the stack is where spells, activated and triggered abilities temporarily go so that other players have a chance to respond to them, like with a counterspell. The reason it's called a stack is that sometimes, especially in Commander, players will go back and forth responding to certain spells, and there may be multiple responses to a certain play, so you need a system of managing this and the order that these responses happen. The stack operates in a last in, first out system, and it does this so that when someone adds to the stack to stop or engage with an existing spell, their spell is the one to resolve first. Still with me? Let's talk about casting spells and priority. Once you've cast your spell, and it's time to give the table a chance to respond, we call that passing priority. Priority basically means that a specific player has the chance or priority to do something. Priority is passed clockwise around the table, and if no one responds to your spell by the time the priority comes back to you, your spell resolves. If it's a permanent, again, it goes to the battlefield, and if not, you get the effect, and the card goes to the graveyard. However, if someone does have a response, they cast their spell, and it goes on top of yours on the stack. That player then passes priority around the table, and if no one responds and the priority comes back to them, their spell resolves. If someone does respond, the process repeats itself until no one has any more spells to cast, and you start resolving the spells. Literally, putting the cards on top of each other on the table can make complex stack management much easier. And an important thing to know is that whenever a spell resolves, priority is passed around the table to give players a chance to respond before the next spell on the stack resolves. The stack is especially important when players want to stop other players from doing things, and here's an example to showcase exactly how the stack works in practice. Say I decide to attack you with a creature, and you decide to block. At this point, it looks like my creature would die, and yours would live, right? Well, what if at the end of the blocker step, I decide to cast a giant growth targeting my creature? It's important to know that a target is chosen when the spell is cast, and it can't be changed later. You'll see why in a second. Now, it looks like your creature is going to die, and mine will live. Aha, not so fast, because you have a response. You play a lightning bolt in response, targeting my creature, and that goes on top of the stack. Now it looks like you have the upper hand, but another player in our pod is seeing this go down, and they decide they want to help me, because they really don't like your creature. They decide to cast a counterspell, targeting your lightning bolt. No one has any further responses, so we now start to resolve the spells. The counterspell resolves first, countering your lightning bolt and removing from the stack. Next up, my giant growth resolves, buffing my creature. This will send your previously safe blocker to the graveyard, thanks to some meddling. The stack is one of the most complex parts of Magic, and it can be absolutely brain-melting, but it's not critical that you master it now. You do, however, need to understand what happens when a spell is played, and how you can engage with that. Whilst the stack is important, winning is far more fun, so let's talk about that. As a new player, the first step to winning is knowing your deck, and I'd advise that before you play your first game, you take time to look through your deck and read the cards. A good Magic deck tends to have a theme and do one thing really well, so reading the cards and understanding what your deck is trying to do and how the cards will work together will greatly improve your ability to both pilot your deck and your chances of winning. Once you've done that, I recommend goldfishing. Now, goldfishing means playing out a mock game by yourself, so you can see how your deck plays out in an ideal situation with no disruption, and how your deck can build towards a win. This will avoid a common new player trap, where you're sitting there taking your turn, not sure what anything in your hand does, or what to play, and it can all be very stressful. But aha, that's not you, because you've already played 10 mock games and know what you want your deck to do. You're basically a pro. There's a lot more to winning, so I've put a video that I've made in the description that will teach you that in much more detail. I've also recently launched the Discord, which is linked to the top right, and in the description. I'm creating it to be the most welcoming and most wholesome Commander community that there is, and as the go-to place to build the best decks on the internet. If that sounds like your place, come join us. Okay, let's talk about a few basic play fundamentals which will definitely help your chances of playing better and winning. The first is resource management. Your primary resources in Magic are mana, lands, and cards. Getting more of these and using them well is very important in doing well in a game of Commander. Using your resources well can mean many things, but as examples, you'll want to remember to keep lands open to cast important instant spells. On the flip side, if you don't do that, or you can't use your lands for an entire turn cycle, it means that your opponents have effectively gained that mana over you, and you could be at a disadvantage. When it comes to the cards, it's a very similar situation. Card advantage, which means situations where one of your cards deals with multiple of your opponent's cards, or where you trade one card for many, is very important. Simply put, more cards wins games. Which handily brings me to threat assessment. This means knowing which of your opponents are doing the most dangerous things, and it can be very difficult to know what the real problems are when you're new. It's easy to spot a big creature, or perhaps just what's currently attacking you, as a threat, but try to look beyond the immediate or obvious things, for things like cards with powerful abilities, or situations where your opponent get big resource advantages, like drawing many cards, or being able to create lots of mana. Given what you know about resources now, you can tell that even if someone has no creatures, that if they just drew 10 cards, they're likely going to be a big problem very soon. The last fundamental I'll give you for now is about actively paying attention to the game and evaluating what's happening. Do things like reading your opponent's cards when they play them, and try to guess what they're about to do next. If they have creatures, who are they likely to attack? Then take that information and think about what you'll do on your next turn. Doing this will make your turns easier and will allow you to likely see players coming and better plan around them. By this point, this video has equipped you with some of the key basics to play Magic and Commander. But that said, here are a few resources that I highly recommend to level up further. I've linked them in the description in the order that they're mentioned. Firstly, I have 2 playlists on my channel with a bunch of videos that teach you different parts of the skill set of a good Commander player. One is about deck building and the other play tips. Outside of my content, the Command Zone has a great learn to play video that I recommend, and the Tolarian Community College, EDHRec, and Salubrious Snail channels make fantastic general Commander content. I'd also highly recommend that you watch some play content, as it'll help you mentally put the pieces together of what you've learned here into practice. and I'd recommend Shuffle Up and Play, game nights, and the Cozy Magic Club as places to go and watch that. Lastly, if you're brand new to Magic, go and download Magic Arena right after finishing this video. You can play for free on either your computer or your phone, and when it comes to learning the basics of how to play Magic, nothing else comes close. Watching this video and then going away to play a game or two, then coming back and watching it again is what I'd recommend you do, as there's a lot to take in and you'll almost certainly miss things on the first watch, and they'll resonate more once you've had some experience. Last, but definitely not least, what if you want to play more and your friends aren't nearby or available? Well, there are a few places to get games, the first of which is your local LGS. Arguably easier though, and much more accessible, is the ability to play Commander online, both with your friends or in online communities. Most bigger Magic creators, like the Tolarian Community College or the Command Zone, have people finding games in their Discord servers, and there are also specific Commander communities like PlayEDH, which is probably the easiest place to grab a game. In terms of how to do this, Spelltable is a really simple way to play Commander online, and you can either use a webcam to play with your physical cards, or possibly even better, you can quite easily use a tool like Moxfield or Archidekt's playtest features to use digital cards. This is something that newer players often seem to overlook or not be aware of, but it has two major benefits over physical cards. First, you can build any deck that you want at a whim for free, because you don't need to go out and buy the physical cards. I have many decks where I've built them online first, played them a bunch, and then realized that I've really liked them and bought them in paper. I've also had many times where I've built a deck online and realized I've hated it, which has saved me a bunch of money. Especially as a new player who doesn't know what they're going to like, this try before you buy option is rather great. And there we are, all done. If you're a newer player and you have questions, or perhaps if you're an experienced player and you think there's something that I've missed that's really important for the newer players to know, please head to the comments. I hope you found this video useful, and if you have, don't forget to like it to send it to the moon. And I look forward to seeing you around the base deck department.